Greetings, listeners, and welcome to the Pop Apocalypse, a podcast brought to you by the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard Divinity School. I'm your host, Matt Dillon, and that is actually one of the last times that I'll be able to give that particular intro. We have some news. The Pop Apocalypse will continue to explore Gnostic, esoteric, and mystical currents in popular culture. But my time at HDS in the CSWR is coming to an end. So the operation and the podcast will be moving to an as yet undisclosed location. I say this so that those of you who have been following the show, however you do so, can continue to follow us when we move on from Harvard and boot up season 4 from somewhere else. So if you're listening on Apple, Spotify, any of the normal podcast audio venues, just click subscribe and we'll appear later on. If you watch on YouTube, hi, hello, you can see me. Scroll down and find our brand new YouTube channel and playlist. And we'll be posting all episodes after this summer right there. If you listen on SoundCloud, there's a Pop Apocalypse playlist that you can follow. And once we're on SoundCloud, we will start to upload the new episodes there. So I will give all my heartfelt goodbyes and gratitude in a later episode to all those who have made the Pop Apocalypse what it has been these last 3+ years. But for now, I'm just asking that you smash that subscribe button wherever it is you take this podcast in so that we can all continue to explore the Pop Apocalypse in years to come. Now, to this particular episode. Actually, 2 episodes. I am thrilled to welcome to the show Robert Schneider. Now, not the deeply unfunny comedian, but the very funny musician, producer, professor, and mathematician. Yes, you heard those 4 words together describing one person. Some of you will know Robert as the lead singer of the psychedelic pop band, The Apples in Stereo. If you don't, please go ahead, press pause. I'll still be here. Go listen to New Magnetic Wonder on Bandcamp or wherever it is you listen to music and enjoy yourself. Are you back? Okay. Robert is also one of the founders of something called the Elephant Six Collective, which you'll hear us referred to as Elephant Six or E6 over the course of the conversation. Elephant Six was started in the early 1990s, basically as a group of friends started bands, and they played in each other's bands. And pretty soon, there was this rhizomatic collective of artists and musicians, most of whom were centered in Athens, Georgia, or Denver, Colorado, where Robert Schneider was located. These people lived together in houses, wrote, recorded, and produced all their own music. What made E6 distinctive, among many other things, is that they avoided major labels and corporations to the best of their ability. So they recorded their own music, as I said, usually at Robert's Pet Sound Studio in Denver. Robert was the producer of many of these albums. And there's an ethos behind E6 that we're going to explore in the interview, so I don't want to give that away now. But to give you a sense of the impact of Elephant Six, the records that Robert produced from it are some of the most celebrated and beloved from the 1990s. Neutral Milk Hotels in the Aeroplane Over the Sea was in the Rolling Stone magazine's top 400 albums of all time and ranked number 4 on Pitchfork's top albums of the 1990s. It's a masterpiece, a classic. You can't say enough glowing words about it. And I do hope you go and listen to it. And if you are so inclined that you buy the record, for some reason, the record is always significantly cheaper than most other vinyl records out there. So the sound quality is great. My thanks to Robert for that. And that's something that if you haven't heard, you should. Then the Olivia Tremor Control, one of my favorite bands of all time. Their Dusk at Cubist Castle was number 39 on that same Pitchfork list, and is generally considered the one of the most influential psychedelic records of the last, basically since the 1960s. And their second record Black Foliage is celebrated in one of those really cool 33 and a third books, which is quite good. And there's many other bands in Elephant Six, not just Robert Zappel's in Stereo, but groups like Elf Power of Montreal, the Minders, the Music Tapes, whom I adore, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I invited Robert on here because I'm a huge fan, as may have just come out for you. But as fits this particular show, we're exploring mystical currents of pop culture. I really wanted to explore the influences and the lived spirituality of Elephant Six. There's a spirituality that I think you can hear that infuses their records and that seems to be indicated in, for instance, Adam Clare's great documentary history, Endless Endless, about the Elephant Six, and then the documentary about Elephant Six, which you can track down pretty much anywhere. So, if you are a big Elephant Six fan, hello, hi, I'm one of you. You'll be happy to know that Robert goes into more depth about the spiritual influences behind the collective than I've ever heard before, and I'm a pretty close follower. We talk about church camps, the Church of the Subgenius, meditation, metaprogramming, cut-ups, psychedelics, and of course, Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys. But that's just the first episode. Robert and I talked for a very long time, and it was lovely. And we ended up with 2 episodes worth of material. The second episode, which will be easy for you to click or find wherever you are listening to this right now, we start by discussing the state of the third Olivia Tremor Control album, which is exciting for those of us who are big fans of that group. But how the story of that particular record is woven together with Robert's own biography, particularly how he ended up shifting from the music industry into mathematics. From there, we explore mystical elements of mathematics, historically with Plato and Pythagoras, through the great visionary and mathematician Ramanujan, or Ramanujan, depending on how you pronounce it. If you don't know about Ramanujan, listen, it's very cool. And Robert's own revelatory experiences with math, and also his explorations of the sort of esoteric side of number theory. It's definitely something different than I've typically gotten to explore on this show, but the mysticism and the mystery behind mathematics is something that's always been of interest to me personally, and I imagine for those of you listening. And Robert is in this perfect position to be able to unpack it as really a sort of living mystical figure himself, who happens to know very deeply the world of number theory, mathematics, and music. So, in any case, I should also note that over quite a few months of emails and then hours and hours of talks, Robert and I became friends. So, more than some of the other episodes for this show, this kind of sounds like a recording of two pretty excitable dudes discussing music, mysticism, and math. Um, I think you're going to enjoy that, though. So, without further ado, let's welcome to the show Robert Schneider. So it is my extraordinary honor to welcome to the show musician, producer, professor, and mathematician Robert Schneider. Robert, thank you so much for coming on the Pop Apocalypse. How are you doing?
Thank you, Matt. I'm so glad to be here. I'm doing great. Thank you.
All right. So
I'm excited to talk with you today.
I've been looking forward to this for quite some time.
It is
So
a super cool show, and I'm really honored to be on here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
thank you for coming on. So, all right, let's dive in because I think we're going to end up going pretty long here. We got a lot to talk about.
That does
Um,
sound like us.
yeah. Um, so ask the first, or ask the same first question for each show because I think it provides an interesting framing for the sort of spiritual life of the guest. So,
Okay, I'm interested.
all right. So we're as a child, teenager, basically in your childhood. What was your relationship like to religion? Were you raised in a church and confirmed? Were you atheist? Were you out with friends reading like Be Here Now and Alan Watts? Where did you land in there?
I did all of those things.
Mm.
Um, okay, let me think about this for just a second. Okay, so I should start by saying that I grew up in Ruston, Louisiana. It's a small town in like the Bible Belt. However, it's a college town, and so it had a lot of churches of different denominations. I think that the town was predominant. Just the town life was like maybe like dominated by like a Baptist and Method. Two big churches were like a Southern Baptist church, and then there was like a Methodist church. And my family went to the Methodist church, but then there were a number of other churches of Presbyterian and Episcopalian, and then Pentecostal and Unitarian and. I'm thinking through the town in my mind as I scanning through the town as a child, and like the I think a lot of there was a Catholic church, and I think that there were a lot of like evangelical kinds of churches. And as a child, I kind of like went to all of those. I went to vacation Bible schools during the summer. There were like a lot of vacation Bible schools in town. It's like every church had a vacation Bible school like on some week, and like all the kids went to all of them, or many of the kids went to most of them. And so you got to meet a lot of kids that way. And also, I guess it was a good thing for parents to put their kids in for the summer. And also you got to like learn about every single church's kind of like philosophy and their different teachings and stuff. It was pretty awesome. I mean, in any event, I had like, for instance, I can remember going to a music camp at the Baptist church, and I think that kind of like changed my life. That's where I like first like learned to play a musical instruments and learned about time signatures and stuff, and I still remember it very well. So I think but like here I'm thinking for a second. But my family went to the Methodist church. I think that sums it up. And at the same time, I had friends in a lot of other churches, and so I participated actively in a youth group that was in the Church of God, which was kind of an evangelical kind of church. And I was in a Presbyterian youth group. And in fact, my parents later divorced, and my stepmom is a Presbyterian minister who also practices meditation and deep spiritual practices. And and I was but then I would go to the Church of Christ, which was I think like a kind of a evangelical church with a friend. And then I went to a lot of different churches as a child. I also went to church camps with a lot of different churches. I went to a Methodist church camp every summer. That was a big part of my growing up, because the community there was really sweet and wonderful and loving. But also, like I went to church camps for the Church of God, which was a different kind of like a church. It was more like evangelical, and I had a lot of different experiences as a child. Like on the one hand, there's that thing, you know, I've been saved at summer camp and sort of scared into it. But on the other hand, I've been at summer camps where it was like it was acoustic guitars and like folk songs and everybody's crying and loving each other so much, and it's all about like the song "Pass It On," which is like you know, like it only takes a spark to get the fire going or whatever the song's lyrics are, which is a very beautiful song, kind of campfire song. So I feel like I had a really nice relationship with religion, and I was interested in it, and I had a diverse taste of it as a little kid. And at the same time, in my household, I had grown up with like sort of like different beliefs. My grandmother I think that my grandmother's religious beliefs like influenced me the most, and she was like kind of like I always have thought of her as being like sort of like a mid 20th century spiritualist, but I'm not sure exactly like what the word around that is. Like you and I had talked, and you had mentioned Edgar Cayce, and I think that maybe that was sort of the realm of sort of religious philosophy that her interest was in. She believed in she was very philosophical, and I think that what she believed in was sort of like falls into the category of New Age thought today. And I think that my mom also inherited those kinds of beliefs from my grandmother. She was her mom, and so my grandmother taught me as a kid these kinds of beliefs, and also my mom had inherited them and transmitted them to me as well. Although my mom's beliefs are more mixed in with traditional Christianity as well. and I think that they were the main kind of like uh, religious influences on me in my childhood. So even though I was bouncing around between like vacation Bible schools and summer camps and stuff, and I think that I gained a deep experience in those. That experience, though, I think was social. I think that my kind of like like religious upbringing was in my household, and I think that it was from my parents. My dad also was like kind of like he's very philosophical. He's an architect, and he when he was younger studied Buddhism, and he had like Taoist texts, and he's kind of a stoic. And so I think that within my family group, I think that that's probably was the greatest influence on me that explains most of my relationship with religion, I think, as a child. Um, does that
So
answer your question? Okay.
it
Or yeah,
does.
yeah.
It
Go,
does.
go,
But
go on.
okay, so I'm hearing had an incredible exposure to Christianity in a small southern town, which is like a very particular stamp that's going to be put on you. And you have these other new agey interests that end up steering you into Buddhism, philosophy, things like this. But
Yes,
where
that's
does the
true. That's
Church
true.
of Subgenius fit in here? Because I know
Okay.
that you
Oh,
have a
it's such a
relationship
perfect
to,
question.
yeah.
Gosh, that's a perfect question. Okay. Okay. I had to think for a second. It's such a good question. Um, So as a child, especially as a teenager in the 1980s, I tended to get drawn into these events locally. That would be youth group type events and social events. But they would generally at some point have the theme of being like something like Satan's involved in rock music and it's bad.
Hmm.
Okay. For instance, um, playing songs backwards to show you that there's backwards masking in the vocals that you could like play it backwards and that there might be backwards messages in it, which is like an incredibly great psychedelic effect that I use constantly and I've been using ever since I was 15 and I first started recording music. It's awesome. I learned it from the devil. They would play Stairway to Heaven and be like, these lyrics were written by the devil. And it's like, those are some of the most beautiful lyrics in classic rock. That song's incredible. Like, that guitar solo is like almost like proof of the existence of God. Like if you want to believe in it, listen to that guitar solo, and it'll push you over the edge. Like that song is beautiful, and you're telling me that that's the devil? Can you produce a lot of great examples in the opposite camp that are as good? Yeah, there's some good songs by Petra. The song "Pass It On" is amazing. There's some great Ode to Joy, I suppose, is arguably Christian music. Like that's an awesome song. I'm just, like there's some awesome religious music out there. I'm not disputing that. But Stairway to Heaven, like you got to pull out something worse if you're trying to like, like convince me otherwise. So as maybe like in middle school, I started to kind of be like, if you're telling me like there's God, the God of love, and I believe in that. Uh, and yet you're telling me also that a lot of this beautiful stuff and this awesome music is coming from the devil. And how can that be bad? And so I think that now I want to note that to my understanding, the devil is just a kind of like demonized. Well, I mean that's even to use that word is that devils and demons and stuff are used to be gods in other religions, and then were like called devils and demons later. That's kind of my understanding about the history of demonology. I'm not sure if I'm right about that.
Well, there's to more or less because you have the daemon, right? The daemones.
Mhm.
That's the Greek term, and these are sort of like spiritual beings. Some people have their own, or many people have their own daimon. So sort of a second personality that influences you in different ways. The Socrates spoke of
Yes.
his daimon extensively. So
Yes.
did Plotinus, but these are all sort of different forms. Charles Stang's Our Divine Double is a great study of this.
Okay. Thank
Um,
you. I'm gonna write.
no
Hello.
sweat.
Okay. Yeah. Go
He's
on.
literally my office neighbor. So I
Oh my gosh,
shout
that's so
out
cool.
Professor Stang.
Hey, tell him
Um,
hey from me.
will do. So that, and then in the sort of early Christian period and a little bit before, you start to see the daimons turning into demons, right? And so,
Oh, I
yeah, a sort of
see.
framing. And of
That's where the
course,
word came from.
yes, yeah.
I see. I see. I mean, I
Uh,
guess I kind of figured that, but I also like didn't know that.
mhm, yeah,
It
and I mean,
became a bad thing.
And the daimonis as good thing still existed in Greek thought. Like if you go into, in particular, theurgic literature like Iamblichus, you can find really great daimones, and there's the individual daimon who communicates with us. That's Philip Pullman's Golden Compass, like is inspired by this. And is actually a really interesting reflection on it. But then there's also like
Yes, yes.
daimones of different areas, different planets, and who just basically fill the stars in a certain way.
I see. I see. Oh, so
And
in the Golden
it
Compass, that is an expression of that with the animals. That's right.
yes,
Yes, of course, of course. Yeah, I got that, but I didn't get that it was the same.
you're
That it was
pulling from a similar
the same
resource.
metaphor. Or
Yeah.
yeah. Oh, that's so cool. That's very interesting. What do you think about it? Do you have a daimon,
I
or do you perceive one?
I do think so. So yes, I am deeply invested in the idea of the human as two. So the idea that we have a sort of conscious, rational self that's bounded by time and is more or less, but not identical with what we would call an ego, and that there is some piece of ourselves, a daimon, if you want to call it that, that seems to reside outside of time, and or at the very least is super temporal. And the communications from that to the conscious entity are going to be through sometimes dreams, sometimes intuitions, sometimes sort of motivations, like strange motivations that come from nowhere. There's a really, I'm we've talked about Jung offline. There's a post-Jungian thinker.
Thank you for those great conversations.
Yeah, that's great. There's a post-Jungian thinker named James Hillman,
Hmm.
and
Oh yeah,
James,
yes, yes. I've
yeah,
been looking into him recently. Actually, another friend of mine pointed me to him.
great. So if you
I'd
want
like to hear
to
more about it, but please tell me.
So I can talk about I've published on Hillman. I can send you stuff, but what I would suggest if you're interested in like exploring the idea of the daimon and the personal daimon, his book Soul's Code, The Soul's Code, is basically a modern. By modern, I mean 1994, 1995, I think he published it. Reflection on it from a sort of Jungian perspective, but taking the daimon outside of time very seriously.
It sounds
And
amazing.
it's a really interesting book, and he actually works a lot with biographies. So I'm a biography junkie. I can't read enough biographies, but this book, he is reading biographies of like artists, writers, and people who he uses them to think through the problem of those who don't grow down all the way, those who are still pretty identified with their daimon, and therefore they come down to
Interesting.
earth, but they can't like live like normal people, for lack of a better term. Like they have trouble with the day-to-day parts of living, sort of like feeding
OMG.
themselves or, staying in a home, but they make this really beautiful transcendent art. So the one that is really
Interesting.
striking on this, so I know that
Yes.
the E6 grunge thing, and these are distinct groups, but the Kurt Cobain story is like so perfect in this. Like when Nevermind came out, he was homeless. Like he had no capacity for taking care of himself. If he was left by himself, he would just eat macaroni and cheese. Like, his home was just scattered with like refuse and like cat shit and just his art everywhere. He couldn't clean anything. But he's making Nevermind, right? Um,
It's not unlike the environments that many of the that many of people that I am friends with, live in, or that even I myself might have lived in at times.
yeah. I mean, you can hear it, right? Like there's something that seems really, really true to that.
I love Kurt Cobain, and
Yeah.
he was somebody that in that I think that we identified with in our social group.
Oh,
I
that's
mean,
wonderful. Okay.
this is his death was heartbreaking for us. I mean, when I this was it's hard to describe the grief that swept through our age group. And yeah, yeah, I loved him and I loved his music. So
Yeah.
I'm just putting that out there. The grunge scene was different, but the grunge scene was, I think Elephant Six just came out of something like a combination of the grunge scene and maybe like the hardcore scene and maybe like a
Yeah.
little bit like a touch of the Deadhead scene.
Yeah.
Maybe like I think the Apples certainly when we started were something like a grunge hardcore band. So
Mm.
I think that you are not far off in bringing that up as a reference also in our conversation. It's really close to us.
Excellent. Yeah, and I mean, when I just read a Cobain biography, so that's why he's top of mind for me too. But
So cool that you read biographies. It's really beautiful because you have all of these different histories of different personalities in your mind.
yeah,
That's like almost like part of you.
yeah, I
It's
can't
a
get
cool
enough. There,
hobby.
it's really
I love that.
it's wonderful to go inside as best you can someone's mind that way.
Yeah, yeah, it's really
But I mean,
cool.
like
It's
he was
amazing that you're
deeply
interested
involved in
too.
like this punk scene, and like he was making his own zines, and like he was very much in this sort of like lo-fi indie space, right?
He
That
was in the
resonates
Olympia,
very
Washington
deeply.
scene,
Yes.
like with K Records and stuff. And that exact same scene was a scene that scene was very inspiring to me and my friends. And I just yes, like it was really cool. Like the thing you're talking about feels to me like it's like legendary. It's so awesome.
Yeah, and now more we're talking about it. There's this the resonances between it and E6 are pretty strong. But I am not
There was
letting
a
you off.
social overlap, like actual
Yeah,
people.
yeah.
There's a lot of overlap there. Like they were just a little bit older than us, that group, and
Mhm.
really, and I think that we were sort of like really looking up to them and trying to be like them.
Mhm. So I'm not letting you off the hook yet, though. I haven't heard about Church of
Yeah, I know. Oh no, no,
Subgenius.
no. Okay. Oh my gosh. Hey, wait. Hold on. Just
Hmm.
wait a second. Yeah, sit down in my chair. This is my favorite chair. Oh my gosh. My lifelong friend and bandmate, my first bandmate, and Bill Doss. This was his chair. And
Oh.
he got it. He got it at an antique store. His wife Amy told me, and took it and painted it and refinished it himself because he loved it so much. It's an old antique chair, and then he had it in his studio room. And I used to sit in this chair when we would record together, up in his attic studio, infinitely often. And so, in any event, after he passed it away, Amy asked me if I wanted it. It's very special to me, and it was already special to me. It was already the location where many magical experiences happened for me, sitting right next to him. And so, and Will used to sit in this chair also, and he would go record there. And
Hmm.
so, in any event, that's my favorite chair.
That's a great chair. Lots of
Thank you.
stories from that chair.
Yes, there are. Okay. The Book of the Subgenius. Okay. In something like the 1970s or something like that, in Dallas, Texas, I think, there was like a new religion that was started called the Church of the Subgenius. And this is J.R. Bob Dobbs. This is like the avatar, like the religious figure for the church. The church is essentially like total absurdity. It's like punk rock, Dada, surrealist, conspiracy theory. Actually, that pretty much covers it.
Hmm.
It's totally absurdist. It expresses a religion that is something like, it's got sort of an element of something like Taoism in it. The highest good in the Church of the Subgenius is slack. Everybody just wants some slack. Just give me some slack. And so, and once you have slack, you're kind of like in the flow, and you just get more slack. And so, like now, the thing is, this church is also hilarious. It's also like, I mean, it's been a while since I've read it, like, and it's from the 1970s. I'm not even sure if it's appropriate. Like, there's lots of nudity. So, like, well, maybe it's not nudity. I can't quite tell. Here's a random page from the Book of the Subgenius. Hold on, let's find
Mhm.
another random page. I'm just gonna literally like, wait. Let me make sure there's no
Yeah.
offensive symbols
Oh,
on here. Hold on, just a second. Okay, I don't think that there are. Okay, nothing that
so
children can
cool.
see. So in any event, it's
Yeah.
like the whole book is like, I'm just gonna flip through now, but noting that there might be inappropriate stuff on
Yeah.
pages here. I don't know. Okay, this is an insane. I mean, it's just an
Yeah.
insane. And it's not insane. It's a brilliant collection of writings by people that were in their scene of artists and weirdos at that time. And it's edited by the Reverend Ivan Stang, same
Mhm.
last name as your office mate. So
Mhm.
please ask your office mate
He
if
is
they
not.
are.
We've asked.
In any
Yeah.
event, it still is a nice synchronicity.
Yeah.
And so, in any event, I grew up in Ruston, Louisiana, which was just down the highway. Ruston is just, at that time, at 55 miles an hour, is 5 hours away. I think it's like 3 hours away or something from Dallas
Mm.
by interstate. It's pretty close. Um, you go from Ruston to Shreveport to Dallas, and it was common going. Dallas was very. It was within the radius of places you would easily go from Ruston if you were going to go to a city.
Mm.
They would go to Six Flags there. So this was a local thing. And all over the region, there were like on walls, bathroom stalls, spray painted onto like utilities around the cities and stuff like that. There was this face in the South, spray painted and or painted or stickered up everywhere. It was like a regional meme that like felt very at the era. It felt very punk rock. It felt like it had a very punk and radical feel to it. Like, what is that face?
Mm-hmm.
And so like and the face was like was the spreading of this absurdist religion. Here, let me see if there's anything. Here we go. This is do what keepeth thou from wilting shall be the loophole in the law. And this is J.R. Bob Dobbs. It says give, take. And the whole thing is playing on capitalism and UFOs and conspiracy theories, the JFK conspiracies and stuff too at that time, which was a big deal in that generation. And it says the church was researching the public's fear of the unknown since 1953. Oh, here we go. The Church of the this is what it says right here in the small print.
Okay.
The Church of the Subgenius is an order of scoffers and blasphemers dedicated to total slack, delving into mockery science, pseudo-futuristics, megaphysics, scatolography, schizophrenitronics, Morialism, sarcastrophe, cinesacrilegion, apocalyptionomany, ESP ectorationalism, and a bunch of other stuff like that. And it says, Bob is, Bob becomes, Bob is not. Nothing is, nothing becomes, nothing is not. Thus, nothing is everything. Therefore, everything is Bob. Abracadabra. Anyway, it's hilarious. It's a total brilliant, amazing Dada punk rock parody of all religions, all wrapped up into one. And yet, when you read it, or at least when I read it, and I'm giving this with the caveat that I haven't read it for a long time, so I need to give it a rereading to make sure that it is not inappropriate. And I'm not standing behind what I'm saying 100%, because this is from the 1980s and 70s. It's a long time ago. But when you read the Book of the Subgenius, I mean, like, what I mean is, like, for instance, I'm not sure that it's appropriate to make fun of JFK's assassination. And that's part of their humorous thing, things like that. So I'm just saying, like, now I think that that's not, I don't know. I'm just saying it's a different vibe. But this is the era of, like, Devo. That's what this feels like. This is like religion as if the band Devo had made it up. And so, like, hang on just a moment now. Where was I going with all of that? I'm looping back. Oh, yeah. In my reading of it, it completely disconnects your mind with all of the absurdity and surrealism and humor. And in that, it gives you this idea about slack, this idea of something like that you can be in the flow, and that's a thing to try to follow. That to me feels right. It feels like synchronicities. It feels like the Tao following the thread, following the middle path. It's a funny word, slack. Cut me some slack. It's a funny word to use for the highest good, but in fact, you know, it is an appropriate. Slack means a relaxed state, and I feel like it disconnects your mind through a bunch of really, really funny and clever and bizarre and interesting. Like, you could read it forever. It's got so many little collages and stuff, and it's artistic and poetic. It disconnects your mind through this sort of absurdity and, like, puts you into a state that feels like what religions do through rituals in the book, and when you're reading it. For its generation that it was speaking to, the generation of baby boomers and the earlier Gen X, punk rock generation, it's expressing something that actually does come off like a religion, and it is a movement that has churches and rituals, and it's totally absurdist, and they basically have the flavor of, like, rock festivals, but, like, not rock. I think it's more like noise bands and stuff. Like we're talking about a very, very strange subcultural movement that started in the 70s and 80s and goes on today. Now I think it's a bigger movement, and it expresses a beautiful truth about slack through a bunch of hilarious fictions about Bob Dobbs, who's this businessman who is like negotiating for the salvation of his followers from aliens who are going to take over the earth. And the taking over already happened like a long time ago, like in like 1989 or something like that. So it's like, and so the whole thing is amazing and hilarious. And it was in the air in Ruston when I grew up. The college kids who were these weirdos that were attracted to the art school and the radio station and stuff in Ruston, they like loved the Book of the Subgenius, and they were, and so I was exposed to it, and my friends were exposed to it as teenagers, and I love it. I think that I believe in some aspects of it. I believe in the disconnecting of your mind through hilarious, creative, absurd literature that's really, really fun to read and trippy, and it's really good in the sense of surrealism. To disconnect your mind through art and literature, and then to present it with this philosophy, and also the religious aspects of businessman who's dealing with aliens and stuff. It's so absurd as to be clearly not something to believe in. Mm-hmm. And in the wash of the whole thing, underneath it all, there's slack. This idea of this relaxed state, and I feel like that's teaching a truth. I think that's a truth. That like different religions have kind of different truths, and like Christianity's truth is something like turn the other cheek. Like nobody would do that. It's like really a different thing to say, you know? Mm-hmm. Like nobody does that. like you have to really, really focus to turn the other cheek. You know, it's a really different philosophy. It's like enlightened because of that. It's like you hear it and you're like, that's really different. I would not have thought of that. And that's what the idea of slack is like to me. Mm-hmm. Through all of the humor and stuff and this absurdity and the collage art and the punk rock and all of this stuff, like suddenly like there's this like there's this idea that emerges of like following the middle path. And that if you keep following the middle path, it feeds back on itself and keeps giving back to you. And I think that that's so like anyway, that's the Church of the Subgenius. I follow it, and when I was in my 20s, I signed up. You can become a minister in the church by sending them like $5. Now it's probably more. So I signed up, and I'm a reverend in the Church of the Subgenius. And I have I've given one wedding. I married my little brother and his wife, and I was very proud to do that. And yeah, it's like I think I'm in a number of religions. Like, look, I'm in the cult of Brian Wilson, mm-hmm. which also I'm in Elephant Six. Our religion is music and friendship, and then I'm also a follower of Ramanujan in math. I think that the religion is also friendship. And creativity, I guess. And then I'm in the Church of the Subgenius, and then I also am interested in a lot of other religions. Like I had told you before, I identify as a philosophical Taoist, which simply means I follow the Tao Te Ching and the Yi Jing and stuff like that. I'm not a full-on Taoist, which is like a whole religion that I would like to learn more about. So I would say that the Church of the Subgenius is awesome and brilliant. And amazing, and it blew my mind as a child, and it still blows my mind. And I think that, but particularly growing up in that small town, it was a good influence on me and my friends. And I think that it also, like I was just saying, there were these like pep rallies we would go to where they would tell us about how backwards masking, which is an awesome psychedelic recording technique, and Stairway to Heaven and such were like came from this evil place, and yet they were clearly beautiful music. And like to me, those were good influences, good influences. Me talking to you makes me realize so much about my life. Like we really were taking that. We took a piece of that absurdist collage art, subcultural religion, and turned it into our little thing.
That's the thing. Yeah.
I didn't realize that until you. Are you asking me these questions on purpose?
I mean,
are you like
it's an intuitive.
Are you a trained therapist?
I am not.
Okay.
I am a trained psychology of religion person.
Okay,
but I think that
you're doing a very good job of putting these things together and these themes that I didn't recognize.
Well, I think it's just there in the art. So, I mean, I'm kind of going to ask another question that.
Yeah, but that's a very, very awesome observation, and I'm glad you asked me about it. And I just realized so much. I mean, like all that time that I was into the Subgenius that I'm talking about was right before we started Elephant Six, and while we were starting it, while we were starting our whole life, our whole musical and artistic life. So like I hadn't thought about it, but it was a huge influence on our presentation, and also on the fact that we sort of had this perceived ourselves as being able to start like something that is not a cult, but like a micro group that was separate from society, like a collective. We started a collective,
Yeah,
and
so
that's what.
just so I'm
Yeah.
following. So
Thank you.
we're speaking to your, thank you. We are speaking to your involvement in Church of Subgenius, but I'm hearing that like Will Cullen Hart and Bill Doss were also interested and
Okay, so I think they all were exposed to it and were interested in it. It was a meme. It was a meme in our community.
yeah.
It was something that everybody was familiar with. Um, uh, I, I
Because
don't
the
know
other
about Jeff Mangum because he has his own esoteric stuff that he's into, and he but I think that certainly Will and Bill would have been into the Subgenius as well. And for
yeah,
me
and
and Will, it was a touch point. It was something we would discuss.
it makes sense. I mean, you hear Will talk about using cut-ups, right? And
Yes.
what are Borosian cut-ups if not like ways to decondition the mind and break free of this sort of linguistic prison? And when you look at
Exactly.
Church of Subgenius, a lot of the absurdity is basically trying to like break you out of this conceptuality of religion or in society, and like
Yes.
there's other possibilities out there, right? So
Yes, you're right. That's what it
uh
is. It's like it's absurd, but it does provide you with a totally different mythology and story
mhm.
and religion, and it kind of like allows you to see that there could be that.
And it's very inventive, right? So you can, it's kind of like there are these things called hyperreal religions, of which Church of Subgenius is understood to be one. It's a terminology that gets used for religions that come from inarguably fictional sources.
I see.
So, like Jediism is considered a
I see.
hyperreal
I see.
religion, right?
Oh, interesting.
But
Interesting.
hyperreal religions open so many interesting questions, but one of the things that they do that's so important is by virtue of the fact that they are fictional and imaginative from the beginning, rather than engaging per se with truth or dogma or belief, you're engaging with the imagination and
Yes,
what
I
is
love
the
that.
truth of the imagination itself,
That's what it
right?
is. That's what it
Yeah.
is. That's it. That's it. It's bringing out the truth of the imagination, like you're saying. That's a beautiful way to think about it. You're right.
Yeah.
You're right. Kind of
So,
like Salvador Dali waking up and having the paint, the canvas right there at the bed, at the foot of his bed, so he could paint coming out of it, the sleeping state. He would do that. That was one of his methods.
oh, that's great.
It's that
Yeah.
kind of thing. I really love the way that you framed that.
So yeah, no, so this is kind of building. So I wanted to talk with you about the sort of like spirituality infusing Elephant Six. Not like worship or anything like that, but it's friendship, but it's also like now that we're talking about it, it's influenced by Church of Subgenius, right?
Yes.
You guys are it's in the water that you were talking about like vegetarianism, organic farming,
Yeah. Sure.
your songs, but at the same time talking about like reincarnation. And
Certainly.
yeah. So yeah, I mean, I guess I kind of just want to like
Oh.
sit
Yeah.
back and
Yeah.
because this when
Hmm.
I'm what so
See.
I've read the Adam Clare book, I've watched the documentary, I've been following you guys forever. When I am seeing the Elephant Six phenomenon, aside from the fact that it made some of the most important art of the 90s and the last like 50 years,
Thank you for
there's
saying that.
no, I mean,
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I am
That's
an
very, very kind
enormous
of you.
fan.
Thank you, Matt.
The okay, so and this is the Athens scene, but like you basically have a group of people who have chosen poverty, right? Like people are they're on like food
I mean,
stamps.
maybe in some cases they would have preferred not to, but they weren't
Yeah, but
willing
they
to go out of their way we weren't willing to go out of our way to do the opposite.
exactly. Exactly. It's very communal, right? In the sense
Yes.
where if you are surviving on not much, you kind of have to become communal is one part of it.
Yes,
Like
and you can also it's also it's efficient. You can if you can get
yeah.
along, you have to get along,
Yes.
and so that's part of it. You can live together, and then you can pool your resources, and you can pool your spaces, and you can pool your musical instruments, and you
Hmm.
can also like possibly even like afford to set up your sleeping spaces such that you have one empty room that everybody can put your instruments in instead, and then you have a band room. So
Mm.
I think so it works very nicely to have something like that,
Yeah,
and then the
and
band room is that's your temple. That's your like space that you go into to be together and also to kind of like to make music, and
yeah,
in that scenario, that's your religion
yeah.
in the context of what we're talking about now.
Well, and there so devoted to a craft, but into the so one of the things about living in Why is my brain just because you're in Georgia? Blah, 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 blah. Why did I forget the name of the town? I'm
Hmm.
sorry.
We were in
Uh,
Athens,
Athens.
Georgia,
Thank you.
and also in Denver, Colorado. Those were the two
Yes.
places that Elephant Six was really kind of like centered.
Yeah. So I
And
think about
most of the people lived in Athens.
yeah. So on keeping these sort of monastic, quasi-monastic resonances, the abnormal sleep schedule, right? Like the this discussion of like making music until 4, 5, 6 in the morning, and
It's
then
the best
keeping
time. Everybody's asleep.
yeah. Yeah, so you're basically like fighting brain chemistry. So you're in this more like dreamlike state.
That's definitely
There's
true.
this, I mean, we talked about this before, but the sort of psychedelic stuff and
There's
cannabis,
certain,
etc. It's
there's
very much
actually
there.
psychedelic drugs and experimentation going on,
Yes.
as well as like psychedelic philosophies and music and techniques and stuff like, and then also like things like using meditation and
Oh,
drones and other things to try to go, get to get other places with our minds. I think you're right.
so what?
I think that what you're saying is very interesting because you're framing Elephant Six in a using the metaphors and the rituals of something like religion. And I
Yeah,
think
I
that
mean,
that's
I'm
cool.
thinking
I think
like
that
a
that's cool.
spirituality.
It feels like that inside it. It definitely feels like
Yeah.
that inside it. That it's something like it's a group. It's a collective. It's not a religion because the religion is
Mm-mm.
something like music and friendship and
Hmm.
maybe sub religion of vegetarianism. But like I think that, but not everybody's a vegetarian. And maybe not everybody's friends, like within the whole group. But I think that friendship certainly, I think they would be if they met.
Mm.
I think that it's interesting to me. It's interesting.
It just
I can see that I can see this theme actually now that we've talked about the subgenius and you've shown me how
yeah.
that connects to this. I can see that there's a theme emerging here.
Yeah,
Hmm.
and I mean, I think I mean, I'm not. You are the expert on Elephant Six. I'm just trying to think it aloud.
Well, I'm not sure if I
Um,
am because I'm not self-aware. I'm like
yeah.
I'm within the group, and so I'm not aware of its external. I don't have a good sense of how it sits from the outside.
Mm.
I have a sense. I have a great sense of mythology, but it feels like I'm within the mythology, acting it out. Do you know what I mean? Like it doesn't feel like it doesn't feel. I don't have a good sense of like what it looks like. It feels
Yeah.
like I'm in a small group, and in that small group, we have a story arc that goes back to childhood.
Very close. Yeah. So let me ask. Let me press on some of the things you said. Meditation. So what sort of like were people into like transcendental meditation and trying that on, or were they
Well, I
doing
think
like
that some of our friends probably did transcendental meditation. I think everybody in the Elephant Six is more or less interested in things like in meditation specifically, and I think that I can't speak for all of my friends, but it's a widespread interest, and I myself had tried a few different meditation techniques, and I used to meditate. I meditate irregularly, but I used to meditate a lot, like 2 hours a day when I was in my 20s, during the time that Elephant Six was going at its strongest and that we were recording a lot. I think I needed that. The Elephant Six is a large group of people. There's
Mhm.
like hundreds of people, and they all live in different places and all are different friend pockets. So I can't speak for everybody. I can
Mhm.
speak for the movement in a sense as a spiritual philosophy or as a art thing,
Mhm.
but I can't like speak for every single person. So I will say that it's a widespread interest, and I'm guessing that everybody has tried it or engages in it often
Mhm.
in meditation. And I myself have found it to be very, has been super impactful for me. When I was in my 20s, I wanted to meditate and I couldn't figure it out or get anybody to teach me how. I went to some like Buddhist temples, and I used to go to the Krishna temple. Our friends would go to the Krishna temple because they would have a free vegetarian meal on Sundays and then a service. The service was amazing.
Mhm.
God, it was so cool. And then on top of that, the food was amazing. So in any event, I think that going to the Krishna temple was a big influence on me because of the fact that music and vegetarianism were at the center of their and the food, the serving of food was at the
Mhm.
center of their movement. People are hungry. It feels good. It's a very nice. It's very nice to give food. And also the whole thing about the Krishna movement is it's all about sound. It's about chanting, like we had talked about before. I remember them saying, I think that they would say something like, you think the name of God, you say the name of God, you hear the name of God, you think the name of God, and then it's like a cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get in this feedback loop. I think that that's kind of maybe like at the heart of mantra-based meditation, is this getting a feedback loop going. And that's totally also what being in a psychedelic band feels like. Whether you're recording in the studio or playing with your friends, it's probably similar to being in a free jazz band or an electronic band, where you like get in this mode where you're just like kind of like feeling each other. And I think music is really powerful because it's real. The sound waves are real. Like music, think about all of the beauty of music that you like. Think about all the interest in it, and think about all of the emotion in it. Just think about music that you like for a second, and then recognize that that is actually like a real force that travels through the air, and you hear it in your ears, and it resonates in your body. You feel the bass. It's traveling through you when you hear music. It's not just going in your ears into your brain. It's traveling through you, and your whole body is a resonator, and your nervous system and your sense of touch feels it. And music is it's real. Music is something that resembles things that we think of as being spiritual forces. Mm. It contains beauty. It contains information. It contains emotion. It travels invisibly through the air. It passes through us. It permeates us when we're embedded in it, like a field. And yet it also contains information, this beautiful musical information that then we translate in our minds, and it gives us artistic, aesthetic beauty as well. It's really amazing. And I think that as a musician, when you're a musician and when you're playing with others, or when you're recording, or when you're playing on your own, you're producing a sound field that you are then embedded in. You're not just the player and the listener. You're also physically a resonator. We are bodies. And it's a very, very, very awesome and amazing thing. And then if you have headphones on like you do, a microphone like you do, then your voice, you think the thought, you speak the thought goes into the microphone, the thought goes into the wire, the thought goes into the mic preamp, the thought goes into the recording device, the thought comes out of the recording device into the headphones, the thought goes into your ears, the sound goes into your brain, you have the thought, you speak the thought. And it's the same exact thing. It's just that you've added a bunch of electrical devices into the feedback loop. It's very beautiful. Recording music and playing music and using electricity is beautiful as well. That's my whole realization from Ohm's law, is that the feedback loop from Krishna, the Krishna Consciousness movement, is also the feedback loop that we get when we're in a recording studio.
Oh.
You have you think the song, you sing the song, you hear the song. And so that's really beautiful. Hang on. Oh my gosh, I got so far off track from what we were just talking about. Or am I perfectly on track?
You're on track. No, we're good.
Okay. You're making me see a lot here, okay? Because with your show on mysticism you've asked me as a member of a collective that clearly has a mystical feel to it. So I'm going to say that the influences, some of the largest influences on Elephant Six are Sun Ra. Mm-hmm. And Sun Ra and the Arkestra express the sense of cosmic religion, and this is a feeling for us that we tried to put out through our presentation, and actually through playing their music. But also, it was something. I'm just saying this sense of a cosmic religion.
Yeah.
Like that is again, I would think that Sun Ra, that what he's preaching, I suppose. I don't think it quite fits as what did you call those kinds of religions?
It's not a hyperreal religion.
It's not a hyperreal religion. It's real.
He's a Gnostic.
That's right. He's actually like laying out a cosmology too.
Yes.
So okay. But this we have these influences certainly in our collective. But I want to go back for just a second. Is it okay if I go back for just a second to what we talked about before?
Sure.
About my childhood upbringing?
Of course, yeah.
Okay, because remember that I grew up in the same small town as many of the friends that I started Elephant Six with. It started in Ruston. And so they also were embedded in the same community of churches and church camps. For one thing, when I brought up about trying to be scared away from rock music by Satanism, or by its connection to Satanism, the music that they would often bring up would be heavy metal music. And heavy metal music at that time had a very evil look to it. It was a cross between glam and kind of like horror.
Hmm.
Mostly glam, but like bands like Motley Crue and Ozzy Osbourne, these were the bands that they would be showing as being like prototypical devil worshipping bands. Like they have pentagrams on their album covers. These were bands that would be shown to us to shock us with the very imagery that they themselves were producing as bands, as artists, to like to try to be scary, to look kind of like to look badass.
Hmm.
That same imagery was being used by the church to say, look how scary and bad this is. And it's like literally they're trying to do that. You listen to the lyrics of Motley Crue, and there's albums called "Shout at the Devil," and it actually like turns out that it's all about like rebelling against authority. That's the devil. I'm just saying, if you like listen to the lyrics of heavy metal, it's always really good stuff. Black Sabbath, they're like talking against nuclear war.
Mm.
It's like they're always like the heavy metal bands that everybody thinks are all evil are generally like actually like trying to make a contrast with their imagery. It's all doom and gloom because they're trying to like shock you into a little bit of awareness.
I also just want to just really quick. One of the things that's really fun as you become an adult and you go back and the first 6 Black Sabbath records are fucking incredible.
Oh my God,
so
incredible.
like listening to them at least once a year, just all the way through. But like, there's so much. It's like they're like a Christian metal band at times.
Yeah,
like,
it's incredibly religiously themed.
Yeah, like you can just like it's like Prince of Darkness and like moving towards the light. Like it's very like it's imbued with this sort of like rich, almost Christian sensibility in certain places. And it just goes to show like this one, the binary is incredibly false. But it's actually actively like ironically hilarious that people are like pointing to Black Sabbath like, this satanic band. It's like, have you just read the lyrics actually?
Yeah, it's right there. Like look at the song titles. They're using scary words that are in the Bible.
Yeah. Anyway, like, sorry, I didn't mean to interject. But
no, it's like, Stairway to Heaven's like that. Like Stairway to Heaven, it's like they're not praising the lady who tries to buy her Stairway to Heaven, but they're kind of like saying she's still forgiven. It's like the whole song's kind of about that. It's like it's sympathetic, but also a little judgy, but it kind of like lands sympathetic. I think. I think that's it feels positive.
This is true. Yeah.
It's like yes. I think that's and the other thing about heavy metal is that the imagery around it is also heavily occult imagery, and that brings you. It's similar to goth, where it's like the imagery around it is somewhere of a mix between like wizardry and like druidism and like the Indian like philosophy or fashion, and like maybe like a little sci-fi or something. I don't know, like the being into I mean, you got like leather and studs and stuff like that too. I think but being into heavy metal gives you it gave you at that era that heavy metal was like that. It gave you a fashion movement and sort of like a set of symbols that were countercultural and that were shocking to the mainstream people, and that helped you to identify with each other if you shared them, like Black Sabbath T-shirts. And that were very much like having a fish to show to show as your movement was is the name, is the symbol to let you into the meeting. Like you come in with an Ozzy Osbourne shirt or something, and like I think that heavy metal gave people in the era and still they gave it gives a countercultural movement that also connects you to that allows you to connect in a safe and in a social way to forms of mysticism. I think that's accurate when I say that. I think heavy metal is, along with jazz, I think heavy metal and jazz are two forms of music where you can safely discuss and connect to mysticism while still being cool in your peer group. And the Elephant Six is like that too. Yeah. Like you can so like okay. So now I'm thinking about it though. We all my friends, the friends that I started Elephant Six with in Ruston as children, because there were other people that were involved later, and particularly in Denver. We came together in musical interests, listening to heavy metal. So it was in like 6th, 7th, 8th grade, and we all went into things like punk rock and psychedelia and noise music and other kinds of new wave and other kinds of music that we liked also from there. But and some of my everybody doesn't like to admit to this kind of thing. But like it was through listening to heavy metal, reading metal magazines, trading tapes with each other, and talking about heavy metal that exactly the group of people that formed Elephant Six in Ruston got together, including Bill Doss and me, through an ad where he wanted to have a band that was like Van Halen, Rush, Van Halen and the Beatles, and I was into Rush. Anyway, okay. We got together because being into heavy metal was, for one thing, it was a fast evolving form of music at that time, especially like power metal, hair metal. These were in the era that they were coming out. They were very, very awesome. They were they weren't that different from punk rock in their presence in the U.S. at least. They had a similar feeling. For instance, the first Motley Crue album, if you listen to it, it's very punk. It's more punk than the Sex Pistols in its rawness. And it's less connected to classic rock in some senses. So like I think the metal scene at that time was very raw, and also I still think that it was awesome as far as the sound of it goes, and it felt exciting to be into it as a child, a little kid getting into it in the MTV generation, and I think that it allowed me and Will and Jeff and Mike Owens and Joey Foreman and other friends of ours these are friends who were part of our Elephant Six group, even though they weren't always all necessarily in bands. They were part of Elephant Six. It allowed us to be able to get into a type of music that nobody else liked. It was obscure in our town. It was countercultural, so it allowed us to connect together to something that was different. And then also heavy metal branches off from psychedelic music and acid rock in the 60s, and it emerged just before punk rock and around the time of punk rock as being sort of like a similar type of movement of loudness and rawness. They're different, of course, but like heavy metal and punk rock both were things mainstream people didn't like. Mm-hmm. Because and if you were a mainstream person, the difference between punk and metal was basically fashion. I mean, in both you're wearing studs. So like, I think that at that time, I think that you could think of the Ramones and say Black Sabbath in the public consciousness as not being that different. They're wearing leather pants, they have studded wristbands, and they're different. But I'm just saying, like, heavy metal was the mainstream movement that allowed us to look backwards into the 1960s and see psychedelic music with its distorted guitars and thundering drums and similar motifs, and to then look also to branch off into punk rock and then and underground music, because heavy metal was the emblem in popular culture, in the mainstream. It was the emblem that underground music exists. And so if you get into it, then you can go deeper and in different directions. Of course, now heavy metal itself has like 1,000 different genres, and it is its own universe. But at the time that we were children, they were like there weren't that many heavy metal bands ever, and nor were there that many punk rock bands ever. Just the first wave from the 70s, and so heavy metal music carried with it the mysticism, the fuzz guitars. And sort of the sense of thumbing your nose at authority that I think helped to unite us as children, even though we didn't turn into a heavy metal movement. Hang on just a moment here, I'm thinking this through. So I guess that, like, in a sense, all of that preaching to us about the devil drew us closer to the traditional God. Through the back channel, or rather to something that resembled religion. Another thing that I think was important with Elephant Six is that growing up in this world of churches and church camps, and you have a sense of the kind of community that goes around religion, which is a micro community. Religions are worldwide movements. They're worldwide movements, but they religions are mainstream is what I'm trying to say. But every religion has with it a a connection back to its earliest stages when it wasn't mainstream, when it was first founded and it was sort of countercultural. So every religion has some appeal all the way back to the followers sitting in the garden with the Buddha, or the followers sitting in the garden with Jesus. And it's, there's this sense of a small group and people, human beings. When you're in a religion, you're not in a corporation. You're in a movement where you have heroes and characters. And a mythology that is finite. It's not that many people. You know the name of the follower who smiled when the Buddha held up a flower. That's a person to you. You know what I mean? Like, you're in that movement, and there are these people in mathematics. I identify with Ramanujan, and I identify with Pythagoras 2,500 years ago. Like, they're my friends. And and religion gives you this sort of a sense of, I identify with Brian Wilson. I mean, I was lucky enough to meet him, but I'm just saying, in any event, I identified with him before that. You have these friends across time and space that are very rare, but they're like you, and you get to just get like a signal from them to tell you that you're not alone. And that's what art is like, and religion's like that. And so
So do you mind if I use
no,
this
you're
as a
just
springboard?
yeah, this is great, actually. Please do. I'm starting to think back into the, yeah, this is very good. Thank you.
Yeah,
Springboard
no,
away.
I want you brought him up, and I think it will be instructive for listeners to, and also I just such a huge Brian Wilson Beach Boys fan, like you are. And so I will basically like bring, and you brought Brian Wilson to the conversation. People listening
I'm
who have
making
just
notes of your
heard you
question, just so you know.
yeah, for heard you just talk about the formative aspects of heavy metal, can be shocked at the extent to which, when it would, again, coming from an outside, if I were to say like what is the sort of like scripture of Elephant Six as like a fan, it seems like it's Pet Sounds.
Oh, certainly. It's
Yeah,
Pet Sounds and Smile, right?
exactly.
It's
And
Pet
I was
Sounds and
gonna
Smile.
say Smile is the Apocrypha,
Yeah, that's right.
right?
Smile is the Apocrypha. I think you're right. Exactly.
Right,
You're
where
right.
you're
No,
like,
that's a very, very good way of thinking about it.
because you're
Brian
like,
Wilson is our musical. He's our idol. He's our god.
yeah.
And he himself appealed to God directly in his music.
Hmm.
And he said he was trying to make a teenage symphony to God with Smile, or with Pet Sounds, actually. And
Yeah.
yes, I think okay. Let me discuss this with you for a moment. I'd like to talk about the role of love in our music and in music. Um, uh, I had talked to you before when we were chatting. We were chatting, and we'll probably talk about it some more. But like the God that the idea of a God that appeals to me and that has always spoken to me is the idea of the God of love. There's different gods. At least there's different ideas of God, whether you believe they're different or the same. And that one has always spoken to me. As a child, I used to go to to church camp. I went to this Methodist church camp in Minden, Louisiana, with this beautiful group of people that were like, camp counselors and some ministers, and then like children that I grew up with from Ruston and then the local region. And it was an amazing summer experience. And it was like its own little like civilization, or like pocket group. And it was this kind of like very 1970s brand of Christianity. It was kind of like I think you described it as Jesus people.
The Jesus people, yeah.
It was all like singing and hugging and like love and loving each other. And the thing that I remember people talking about was being Christ-like. That was like the word that kept coming out, Christ-like. Like, I don't hear that very much now in the modern society, And when you said the word Christ-like, what that meant was gentle and kind and helping others, helping those in need, turning the other cheek, walking an extra mile. This is the idea of being Christ-like, was this idea of being goodness. And I can remember that idea, it's a very beautiful idea, and all, different religions, different versions of religion and different eras have different things that they consider to be important. And at that era, coming out of the 1970s and into the 1980s, this was the feel of the church camp that I used to go to. And I can remember being very moved by the song "Pass It On," where it says, "I'll shout it from the mountaintops. I want my world to know the God of love has come to me. I want to pass it on." If you replace that with the song of love, you have a more general sentiment. And that's what I feel like Elephant Six feels like. To me, if you hear the lyrics of that song, Pass It On, it says, the chorus is like, I'm hearing it in my head just a second. It's like, that's how it is with God's love. Once you experience it, you see his love in everything. You want to pass it on. I think that's the lyric
Mm.
of that song. It's very beautiful. I would like you to abandon your idea for a second of God or religion or culture or the word God or anything and just be zero, and then hear that lyric, and then take that feeling you get from that, I want to pass it on, and make that the definition of God for you, having wiped away all other conceptions. Let that feeling, the spark, springtime that song expresses, be the definition. That feeling you get of wanting to pass it on, that to me moves me still, and it moved me as a child. That song, I can remember just loving it as a child at church camp, and even going as being a teenager. It's a beautiful song, and I feel like like that. The spark, the springtime, the wanting to pass it on, the shouting it from the mountaintops, like that is the feeling from Christianity that carries into Elephant Six. And it's not a feeling of salvation, but rather a feeling of joyous sharing, spreading. And I think that to me is, it speaks to me as a model for any religious movement. And it speaks to me as an emotional model for treating each other nicely, and and it also is like a nice way to look at the world.
Yeah.
So like it's like yes, the song is a religious song about God. And if you take the word God in that song to mean the thing that song is expressing, like it is defining itself. Because the word God is an empty box for what you project into it as the individual. Everybody has a slightly different feeling of what that means. And like, if you allow that song to define it for you, it gives a really good feeling to me. I'm not trying to tell anybody what to think about God. I'm just saying like that feeling though, that feeling, passing it on, shouting it from the mountaintops, that is the feeling of Elephant Six. And that is the kind of like the feeling of the church camps and of the era that we came out of as children growing up in this kind of town and environment. And I feel like I do want to carry that on, like I do want to shout it from the mountaintops. Like I do want the world to know. Okay. So now, so
That does definitely come across in the albums.
that was something that to me, I hadn't, we're talking about this and I haven't thought about this before. You're kind of, you pulled it out of me by like mentioning the thing about the Subgenius and stuff. I'm seeing that it was actually I have always seen our Elephant Six as being detached from the environment that we grew up in. We were listening to college radio and influenced by these college kids to become punk rockers. That's how I've seen the story of Elephant Six. But what you have rephrased it as is, or not rephrased it, but what you actually like pointed out a spark of is that actually it was our environment, and it was the sense of there were aspects of the religion that we were brought up in that carried themselves into our 20s. And we became and that's interesting to think about. Okay, but so hold on. You asked me about something specific. I wrote it down. Hold on.
Oh, I just wanted to...
Brian Wilson. Yeah. So that brings us to Brian Wilson.
Yeah.
I was born in South Africa, and I was born in Cape Town, South Africa. And as a little kid, I would go to the beach with my parents, and I loved the beach and the ocean, and I have memories of that. We moved to America when I was 6 years old. My parents rejected apartheid, and my dad had gotten offered a job as an architecture professor, and so he took it, and we moved to the United States. And from that time on, I always missed South Africa. Like I didn't miss white South Africa. I missed the ocean and the like the savannah, the veldt, or the mountains, and like the flowers and the animals of Africa, the patterns and the people, and like these were in my subconscious mind from childhood. And when I thought back on my childhood, I had this feeling like it was this Garden of Eden. I could think into Africa, and I could remember things like seeing elephants, and it was like a tropical paradise, and like I was a little kid, and I lived in this family, and was the upbringing that I had described with I remember it as being a nice little bubble. And I suppose it wasn't perfect because my parents left, obviously, and it certainly wasn't perfect for 99% of the people who lived in South Africa.
Mm.
But like at the time, it was just from my childhood. I only remember my bedroom and our yard and the garden and going on walks and things like that. And like so I missed the ocean. And as a little kid, I heard the Beach Boys and their songs about the ocean it triggered the memories, the images. And so I loved the Beach Boys. I'm just saying, when I was a little kid, the Beach Boys were my favorite band, way before heavy metal. I loved the Beach Boys. I loved all of their beach songs because I had lived that, and when I heard it, it made me go back into my childhood, and it gave me that feeling again, this Garden of Eden. And so, like, I love the Beach Boys, and their music really helped me in my childhood to kind of like I don't know, I don't know what I just when I think back on my childhood, I think about listening to the Beach Boys. I had Endless Summer, that double album it was a double album. It was the greatest hits of their beach material. Had very psychedelic art on the cover too. I remember looking at it, it was like looking at a storybook and listening to the music. Brian Wilson was the leader of the Beach Boys. He was their bass player and one of their lead singers, and he wrote most of their material in their best years. I'm just saying this for your listeners. I know you know. And like and he's my musical hero. He wrote beautiful songs, and in addition to that, he was a great musician. He was a great bass player. He was a great piano player. He could basically play all of the instruments. He also would produce the Beach Boys recordings. He was involved in the engineering, the setting up of the sound in the studio, as well as he would arrange it. That is, he would write the instrumental parts for all of the other instruments and musicians that would come in. He wrote all of the songs, all of the parts, all of the vocal parts. Was involved in the engineering, produced it, he basically did everything in the recording process. There aren't a lot of people like that in music. And as I was growing into teenagerhood and starting to get into recording and teaching myself to record at home, this spoke to me because for me, I got into music and recording and writing songs all at the same time as well. I'll tell you more about that later because we're talking about Brian Wilson. For me, those things are all wrapped together, and what I saw in Brian Wilson was a hero who could do everything. And so, like, you'll notice that I like tried to do everything. If you like were to look at the things that I tried to do, I'm still trying to do everything. And so, for me as a young person, Brian Wilson gave me a model of exactly what I want, what I could do, what was doable by a young person. Of course, he was like a famous rock star in this famous band from the 60s, but that's sort of like, it's irrelevant in a future era, how people did things in the past era. You can't like make a living now being a telegraph operator. Yeah, it was a cool job. Great. Being a songwriter on Tin Pan Alley would be a cool job too. I live in the 1990s up to now. So in any event, he provided for me a model of that, and I did that in Elephant 6. I had a 4-track cassette recorder, and I started to record with my friends. I did this in high school even. I would record with my friends, and I had this ambition that I could also be a songwriter and a producer and all of this. So for me personally, Brian Wilson was a really big deal to me, even as a teenager and as a child. He has been the major influence on me throughout my life through music. When I was a teenager, I got really into Pet Sounds. And it was the soundtrack to my teenage years. I listened to it constantly, and it's this great album, one of the greatest albums of all time. And I kind of like turned my friends onto it. They also turned me. We were all turning each other onto lots of different kind of music, and like this was to me the greatest music I'd ever heard. It's like religion. To hear Pet Sounds and to hear Brian Wilson's greatest work is the greatest pop music. It's as great as pop music can be. And so it's like majestic. It's like you're able to listen for a moment into something like heaven from the context of our era and our culture and sort of like our musical influences and the things that would make sense to us. You then like to listen to that. It's like listening to Stevie Wonder, or like, there's some music that when you listen to it, you're listening into heaven. Like you were talking about the daemon. And I will say that space exists. That space that you described, that's not like a fantasy. We live in a physical world, but there's also a space of information that is contained in our world, but is separate from it. The information in this book is sitting there untouched by time. The information in a computer program is untouched by time. The information in you is untouched by time. It's sitting in a space of organized information that is separate from the rest of the physical processes of the world. This page has different symbols on it from that page, and there is nothing else to distinguish them as far as like if you throw it at a wall or something like that. Its physical properties are the same. The information on it is different. So that space that if you want to believe in the sense of a daimon, then you can go ahead and do that because that space exists, that space of information, and it may well sweep through us for all I know, and like provide us with new input constantly or from time to time. Okay, moving beyond that though, Brian Wilson. The thing about Brian Wilson is that, and so particularly my best friend Will Hart and I, who was Will and I were best friends in high school and in our 20s. I mean, through our whole lives. But like, we conceived Elephant Six together, and he drew the logo and named it. Will and I listened. We used to get together on weekends and make psychedelic art, surrealist art particularly, and like record together and listen to music. And he and I started to get super into the Beach Boys together as we started to get into college. And so I left Ruston and went to college at Centenary College, which was a small Methodist college in Shreveport, Louisiana, where most of my friends from church camp went. And so it was a really wonderful college that I went to for 2 years. And one day Will called me and he's like, Robert, I'm coming into town. I have to play you something. And he drove all the way 60 miles from Ruston to Shreveport. And he pulled up in my dorm parking lot, and I came out, I sat in the car, and he popped in this tape for me, and he played me the Beach Boys' Smiley Smile. And he's like, "You've got to hear this. This is the album after Pet Sounds." So remember, this is before the internet. The Beach Boys weren't hip. There was no material out about anything about the Beach Boys that like there is now. They weren't considered to be this legendary band. The only people that considered them legendary were other legendary people like Paul McCartney. So like everybody else, the Beach Boys were a secret. He popped in Smiley Smile, and on the other side he had Friends, the Beach Boys album Friends. These are like two amazing albums that came right after Pet Sounds, and they are incredible. I can just remember sitting in his car and listening to both sides. The cassette popped over automatically and played the other side, and it was just like, wow. It kind of like it was a whole new world of music. And we had different influences, and we were both mixed up with different bands and different groups of friends and stuff. But I think that for me and Will, Brian Wilson, and the thing that came after Pet Sounds is what charged us up and made us see our future. However, what we didn't know was this. Pet Sounds came out in 1966, and Smiley Smile came out in 1967. And in between that, Brian Wilson had recorded the greatest album ever made in all of pop music called Smile, which had inspired the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper, but supposedly legend had it blew it out of the water, and then scrapped the album and had a nervous collapse, and that album was lost. And the Beach Boys had recorded "Smiley Smile" as an afterthought, containing some of the same songs from Smile, but different recordings of most of them. So the album that Will and I had heard, and the albums we had heard after Pet Sounds, there was actually a gap there of this album Smile, which was a legend. And as we realized that, and we heard about the legend of Smile, that is what sparked me and Will Hart, and sparked our imaginations about what a new form of music should be like. Because Smile was only existed in legend and in descriptions from the era of what it was going to be like, and it was very ambitious. It was a concept album using musical sounds that had never been heard before, massive budget with huge orchestras in the studio. Brian Wilson was doing stuff like bringing farm animals and burning wood in the studio and stuff and recording it. And like it was incredibly psychedelic for that era. And I don't think, certainly burning wood in the studio and bringing in farm animals probably isn't done a lot, and you shouldn't. It was this wild thing. It was like you know about Apple Records, and you know how wild that was, and then you imagine something way, way, way wilder than that going on in Smile that you didn't see, you didn't know, and so your imagination could go wild. What was going on in that studio? What was it about? What was the concept? That's what Will and I would obsess over. And that kind of, I think that basically drove our music through our 20s. And it certainly was the one of it was a major inspiration for the starting of Elephant Six, is to kind of like chase the promise of smile, and to try to do that on our own terms and on our own equipment, and in our own spaces, and in our own kind of like group of friends. And so I feel like that quest was sort of the quest of our collective. It was the quest for me and Will Hart. Let me think about it for just a second. I think the thing about Smile is that Brian Wilson was a very, very famous person in his era who did something other people didn't do. He stopped touring. And that was a famous move he did. And he stopped touring because he had a nervous breakdown. But but like the Beatles did this at the same time. He turned his focus away from live performance and towards the studio. And what that said to their entire generation was that the studio is the main art form now. Before that, the studio was a place to capture the live performance that you've been practicing. And after that, up from then until now, the studio has been its own art form, completely distinct from live performance. If it happens to capture the live performance, that's a choice you make. And so Brian Wilson, as well as the Beatles, and that generation, but those major bands, when they took themselves away from touring, which is such a huge source of revenue even today for bands, and they focused on their studio work. And now the Beach Boys, though, didn't do that. Brian went into the studio with a studio band and started to make Beach Boys records while the band toured. So they had like the best of both worlds. Whereas the Beatles had the best of both worlds in their own way because they didn't have to tour. So we have this moment in pop history around like 1966, 1967, where recording became the new medium. It became the new instrument, and the studio itself became an instrument. When you hear a recording, you're hearing all of it at once. You're not just listening to the bass guitarist. You're hearing the whole orchestra at once, and that's the new art form. The new art form is not me singing, but me orchestrating. You can put a lot more out, and so I think that's what we read into Smile. That's what we read into it. Now the thing is that Brian Wilson he did that. He took over the studio and he took command of it, and that was very heroic. Even the Beatles didn't do that. Even the Beatles had a producer and an engineering staff. Brian Wilson was the boss of everybody in his studio, and that's really inspiring. All of those people in suits and lab coats were having to listen to the commands and ideas of a teenager. Like, that's awesome. And like, it's really punk rock, that thing I just said. However, and Brian Wilson, when he made Pet Sounds, he was speaking around Pet Sounds around that time. The publicity around Pet Sounds and then around the Smile in Progress album was that he was making a new spiritual form of music. It was a spiritual form of music, and he described it as that he wanted to make teenage symphonies to God. Like, that is so inspiring. Teenage symphonies to God. It sounds so innocent and yet so ambitious. You know, it's like Beethoven at a sock hop. You know, it's like so innocent and yet so ambitious. And to say that is a new generation kind of thing. Like everything that came before. No, it's a teenage symphony to God. It's the new time. It's a new medium. It's a new form of music. And so there's the sense to me and to my friends and to Will, particularly in our conversations, that Brian Wilson is going for God. He's going for not a particular God. I mean, he's going for the God. And he's he's saying this. He's saying this in his music. His song is called God Only Knows. It's the first time God is used in the title of a pop song, supposedly. And so he has connected, and the Beatles make a contentious statement about God, saying we're more popular. You know, Brian Wilson's he comes up with purity and innocence. And he looks into his generation and says, let's make a symphony. You know, let's make us like music of praise. And I think that's it's very in keeping with where the 60s went. The 60s didn't go thumbing their nose at God after that. The 60s went into a very religious mode. where like young people were like burning incense and like going into trances and taking LSD and singing about meditation and like singing about religions.
Mm.
And like and Brian Wilson was like, he was like pushing for that, you know, that was like his thing. So, however, the story arc goes that the story arc that was told at the time goes that he burned himself out basically on LSD and on the project, and on he was a workaholic, and he burned himself out, and he didn't have support within his band, and so he emotionally burned himself out, and in the end he had a nervous collapse similar to what made him quit touring, and he wasn't able to finish the album, and he felt like there were such bad vibes around it that he ended up burning the master tapes. That was the myth of Smile as we inherited it. So it was up in smoke. It was gone. All of that whole era, there was nothing to look at. It was only something to recreate. And the myth is clear. The archetype is clear. The archetype is the archetype of Icarus. Brian Wilson flew towards the sun and he couldn't touch it, and it burned him. And even though that was the story, it was still something that we wanted to try to undertake. We wanted to try to do it again. And the way that we looked at it was that he was burned by the music industry. He was burned by a lack of support within his social circle and his band. He was burned by his friends and by his industry. If we avoid the industry, and if we stay friends, and if we support each other, then maybe we can do that. And I do think that that's possible under those conditions.
Mm.
In fact, Icarus flying solo, or with his dad on the ground, you know, watching with, you know, nervously, is like not the right archetype. The archetype is to like build the tower or fly there together as a flock. If one person's wings are melting, you catch them. And so in any event, the story of Brian Wilson is really, really inspiring at that time, but it also had a sense of defeat to it, and that inspired us too, because we could try to do it again. But now I want to add a postscript. In the 1990s, or the 2000s rather, Brian Wilson got back together with his collaborator from the 1960s, Van Dyke Parks, that he had written the entire Smile album with. And it turned out that since that time, Smile was not burned, but over the years, bootlegs came out, bootleg after bootleg after bootleg, which influenced our music greatly. The Smile recordings came out, and we got to hear what those recordings sounded like, and they were actually better than we had imagined. They're actually cooler than anybody could have imagined. The greatest psychedelic music ever made, and it wasn't burned. It just wasn't completed. And and in the early 2000s, I got Will's called me, and he was like, Robert, there was just a performance in London. I think it was at Royal Albert Hall, and he was like, they performed Smile. And I was like, what? He was like, yes, they finished Smile. They composed it and finished it, and they performed it. And he mailed me a CD there was a bootleg of it that somebody had recorded from the audience, and he sent it to me, and I got to hear Smile as a finished piece of music with all of the lyrics and the vocals, and it was arranged all right. It was performed live. It wasn't the recordings, but I got to hear this composition for the first time, the Symphony to God, and it was like so incredible. Like, this is incredible. This was probably 2003 or 2004, and it was just so amazing. I still have the CD from Will with his hand writing on it. And so a couple of at that time, Brian Wilson and his band of that time re-recorded Smile, and it sounded very similar, but they re-recorded Smile and but with all of the arrangements, and they'd released it. So there's a Brian Wilson solo album that was Smile, and so the finished composition got to come out. And it was awesome. I was the first person waiting when the record store opened that day at the door to go buy it. And it blew my mind. Brian Wilson's Smile changed my life as well in different ways. Because Brian Wilson's Smile, he did it. Like, he got, after like, he had this nervous collapse and went through decades of struggle, and yet he was strong enough that he was able to heal and to pull himself back up and to get together with his old friend, and they still had the inspiration and the notes and the memory, and they were able to actually like finish their composition, and then they were able to get the resources together to perform and record it and release it. And Smile came out into the world like this effort actually, like, the point is that the Icarus story was wrong. It wasn't Icarus all along. It was a different story. It was Icarus plus. It was like part 2, and so that inspired me greatly. Hearing Smile, the new Smile, it gave me the sense of confidence and inspiration to record and conceive the Apple's album New Magnetic Wonder that came out like a couple of years later. And I think that it's our best album, and I think all of our albums are quite good in my opinion, having produced them. But like that album is like a compendium of everything that we could do ever, all in one album. It's like it's like I feel like it's the essential album in that it has a you could listen to that one album and know the Apples in stereo. And like it wasn't me trying to make smile, but the point is that Brian Wilson's inspiration, like at many times in my life, childhood, in my early 20s when we were founding Elephant Six, and then in my 30s when I was at a different place in my life, and it gave me the inspiration to try to attempt what I think of as my best album. Um, uh, and he gave a new myth. The myth is that Icarus picks back up. To me, that's really beautiful. And within the Elephant Six, my group of friends, our community, and our music, we have always celebrated Brian Wilson's music going back to the start. For instance, our first 7 inches that the Apples put out, and when Elephant Six were first releasing cassettes in 7 inches out of our apartment, Will and I made a little handwritten note that we stuck into our singles that we would send out that said, if there was a book at the time called Look, Listen, Vibrate, Smile. It wasn't at the time, it was out of print, but it had been written, it was a very, very small run book about smile that had been written in the 1980s. It was inaccessible. The book itself was a legendary mystery, but we had heard about it, and we asked if anybody could ever had any copies of it or could send us copies of it. And somebody actually like mailed us a photocopy of the entire book. They sat down and photocopied the book and mailed it to us. They bought our single, got the note, and they mailed it to us. And so Will and I actually got to read the book. So we actually at this time when Elephant Six was forming, we sent out a signal and we got back the book. And so we got, and the book has all these interviews and press information and notes from the time and label information and record label information and stuff around Smile, and it gives you basically a map to what Smile was going to be. And this was our Bible.
Did I have to ask, did they send the book to Pet Sound Studio?
Okay, so this was before Pet Sound Studio existed.
That would have been so
They sent it
perfect.
to the Elephant Six Recording Company headquarters, which was our apartment at 63 Logan in Denver. So it came to it was the studio. It was the studio and the record label and our apartment. And so that's where it went to.
Oh, that's
Yeah, it was amazing. It was amazing.
Yeah.
Whoever sent that to me, I'm like eternally thankful to them. A few years later, we met the author of the book, and that was an amazing experience. Look, I've had so many amazing experiences. There's no way I could express to you. Like my life has been so lucky, but I met the author of the book also.
yeah, that it.
Oh, no, no. Oh, there's more. On the day
Oh.
I met the author at a show that the Apples played when we were recording Funtrick Noisemaker, and we were about to leave LA. We had packed up we had driven out to LA with our recording equipment because a friend of ours who lived there, this kid we knew, Brant, his parents were out of the country, and he said we should come set up and record there. And we wanted to be close to the spirit of California, the first Apples album, Funtrick Noisemaker. So we went and we spent 5 weeks there, and we were recording at his house. And then we packed up and we were leaving, and the day that we were going to leave, we got a call from a kid at the local record store who was sponsoring a benefit show. And the benefit show was bands playing songs by Brian Wilson. And we played Heroes and Villains, and he knew that, and he asked us. They had a band drop out, and he asked if we'd be willing to play the first set of the show. We were ready, had packed up our recording gear, and we were basically portable. So we were like, yeah. We just drove back to Denver after the show, and so from LA. And so we went, and at the show, it turned out that we met Dominic Priori, the author of Look, Listen, Vibrate, Smile. For one thing, he was there, and we met him at the show. But there was a kid at the show who his name was Peter, and he was a drummer in a hardcore band the Apples had played with. It also turns out that he was the stand-in like session drummer for Brian Wilson's band at that time. Brian never played. That was the time when he was a recluse. But every few years he would play with some sort of group of LA players who would get together and play with him if he did play. And this kid had fallen in as being Brian's drummer. He was an awesome drummer, by the way. And Peter was at the show when we got there, and he was like, "Hey, this is a secret, but Brian Wilson's going to actually close the show. I'm playing." And he was like, "He's backstage right now. Do you want to come back and meet him?" And so this was like we're recording Funtrick Noisemaker, and we got to go back and meet Brian And I got to sit in a room with him. Actually, I was left with him for about 20 minutes, just me and Brian Wilson, and Elliot Eastman, the guitar player for the Cars, was also in Brian's band, and he was sitting in the room. And so I sat there and talked to Elliot and Brian, mostly Brian, and it changed my life. This was the day that we were leaving California to drive back to Denver to finish Funtrick Noisemaker, our first album, the first Elephant Six album, the album that was expressing my love for Brian Wilson, and I got to meet Brian. It's so improbable. It is a crazy, impossible thing that happened the day that we were leaving, and so he gave me really solid advice about music and art that's I've carried with me my whole life, actually. And he was a really sweet and cool person and was really nice to me. And so I'm just putting out there that I got to meet my God. And so
what did you guys talk about?
it was really cool. Okay. So now remember that I said about how Smile and the tapes were burned. That year was 1994, I think. And in 1993 and 1994, the first Smile bootlegs actually started to come out. It became known that there had been a substantial amount of leftover recordings from Smile, cassette dubs onto acetates in the studio where they made like a short-term little vinyl record that they could listen to. Some studio recording tapes and things that still existed. They were collected together, and there was a 2 CD triple vinyl album that came out of Smile bootlegs around 1993 or 1994. So this was so Smile. It turned out that in 1993 and 94, right when we were learning about this, the Smile bootlegs actually came out. So we wanted to hear Smile. We got the book Look, Listen, Vibrate, Smile, and then Smile came out. All of this happened over the course of like a year, and you got to hear suddenly these early bootlegs. Now I had done a recording with a kid in California. On my 4-track, I recorded a 7-inch for him. I produced it, and he and while we were out there recording Funtrick Noisemaker, he gave me a present to thank me, and it was the triple vinyl Smile. And so I had with me, while in the van, the triple vinyl copy of Smile. So when Peter told me that we could come meet Brian, I was like, wait, hold on just a minute. I ran out to the van, I got my triple vinyl copy, and I came back in thinking I could get him to sign it. Now the other option is that Brian would take it away from me because he thought he burned these things, and this was an unauthorized bootleg of something that he never wanted to come out, probably. So I wasn't sure how to approach it, but I did have it with me. And as I went into the room, to meet him, I showed him that, and he looked at it with great fascination. It had the cover art. It didn't have the cover art from Smile. It had the cover art from Smile, from the album on it. So he looked at it with great fascination, like he is getting the vinyl thing that he didn't make.
Oh.
And he looked at it, he turned it over, he pulled out the triple vinyl. Each of them was a different color vinyl. He handed it over to Elliot Eastman, who was looking at it. And and Brian looked over the songs on the back, and we were talking about the song sequence of Smile. Because this was just a bootleg, so it wasn't like the album. It wasn't the sequence of the album. We were talking about some of the songs, and at that moment, there was an LA pop band called the Wondermints, who later went on to become Brian's backing band. In fact, they were instrumental in having him end up recreating Smile. But at that time, they were a local band who were like just a local power pop band, and they were also playing at this benefit. And I was backstage with Brian in his room, and they were out on the stage playing, and they started to play the Beach Boys song Cabinescence, which is an extraordinary, beautiful, amazing song with harmonies and piano playing, and they played a perfect cover of it while I was backstage with Brian Wilson, but it was playing, and Brian and I both stopped. And I said, "That's a great song. You wrote that. It's so great." And he said, "Yes." And he looked at the album and the song list, and he said, "But it wasn't all." And now I want to note that band in that moment, that they ended up becoming his backing band later. Mm-hmm. So I was there for that. I was there I was there at that moment that we heard the Wondermints. Brian was clearly impressed, but he looked at the album cover and he said, it didn't all come at once. It came in waves. There were high points. And then there were periods in between where it felt like nothing was going on. And he described how his experience of Smile was that there were these peaks, but then there were these low points. And that to me has always inspired me because Smile was incredible, and even at that time when he was inspired and working on one of the greatest albums ever, he was just hitting high points, and in between there was depression. and low points where it felt like things were dragging and slow and things weren't going his way. And you don't get that when you look back at it. Of course, you get it when you know the crisis that it caused him, but you don't get it necessarily when you listen to the music. And hearing Brian Wilson, whom I consider to be one of the most creative musicians of all time and inspired, to hear him describing that era as being an era of highs and lows made me feel really encouraged at all of the periods in my life ever since then, when I've been going through that low period in between where it doesn't feel like there's a lot going on. You're suddenly like, oh, it's not going to come back to me again. I'm done. I've written my last thing. But it's like, no, you're just in the period that's in between, and you will still have another wave. And Brian, he had a very, very long period before that project crested. When Brian told me that in 1994, it was 10 years before he finished and released Smile. So he was in one of those periods at that time with respect to this very same album that we were referring to. You know, he was telling me that from the basin of a low period. And yet he ended up finishing the project. It's really inspiring to me, the story of Brian Wilson, because of the fact that he was both so ambitious, so innocent, and so idealistic. He got burned by the music industry and by his friends, not by the sun god or whatever, by actual people, and yet he healed his friendship, and he came back and he finished his youthful project in his older age. To me, it's a very inspiring project because we often think of youth as being the time that all of this stuff happens, but in the Brian Wilson story, it actually happened in old age. That the most psychedelic album was actually like nailed down, and the whole story to me is just incredibly inspiring. It's like the way I'm telling it sounds like I'm telling a fictional story, and yet it happened, and I met the guy, and I tracked his progress, and it inspired my story, and it's very amazing and beautiful. So the story of Brian Wilson is a very, very is very amazing. He passed away recently, and that's really tragic because I loved Brian, and I had the privilege of meeting him a number of times over the years. At shows, the band The Wondermints, we kept in touch with them, and they've been friends of mine for years. And I would see them they would invite us to their shows sometimes, and I've gotten to spend a little bit of time with Brian. He was always so sweet, and he seemed happy to see me. Like, there's no way he knows who I am as a musician, but it's like he recognized my face, and he always was like, "Oh, it's that guy," and it just like made me feel good. He was awesome. He was such an amazing person, and.
Did you it's thank you for going
Thank
through
you.
the
Sorry
story.
to
It's
give so many
beautiful.
details.
No, it's wonderful. I mean, I've read many of the books, but I have never met the man. I want to add, so you met him a number of times, and I'm sure you talked about the influence that he had on you and on Will Cullen Hart and Elephant Six. Did you get the sense that he was aware of the enormous influence that he had not just on you guys, but like in the 2000s, right? You had this other wave of Brian Wilson influence with like Animal Collective. Animal Collective
Yes, of
couldn't
course.
talk up the Beach Boys enough, right? Like, was he aware, like, wow, this hugely influential pop and experimental rock bands are basically like looking to what I did as the blueprint? Like, when in his older age, did he
Okay, so I would say okay, I think that he was not aware of that.
okay.
I think that Brian, I think he was not aware of that because I think that he was sort of in his own bubble. I'm
Yeah.
not, I think that he probably knew in theory that he was an influence on a lot of bands, but I don't think that he probably knew specifically. Like I would imagine Paul McCartney tracks the modern music scene and knows some bands that that are in a similar genre to him or something. I don't think that Brian was like that. Like there's a story that Don Henley came and met Brian and then Brian like autographed something for Don Henley, and like Brian wrote to a great songwriter or to a great musician from Brian, and then Don Henley turned around and he was walking away, and Brian was like, "Wait, who was that?" And they're like, "It's Don Henley. He's from the Eagles." And he's like, "Oh, wait a second, come back here." And he came back, and Brian took the CD and he crossed out "great" and he replaced it with "good." So I'm saying if Brian didn't know Don Henley,
Yeah.
he was that honest too.
Yeah.
But if Brian, this is a firsthand story that somebody told me they saw. So if Brian didn't recognize Don Henley, he doesn't know the Animal Collective.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
fair.
so at the same time, though, like I think that it's such a cute story.
That's so funny.
It's so funny. So
Yeah.
like in any event, so I think that the answer has to be no,
Yeah.
but it's just Brian in particular. I think that there's no way he could have known it. He didn't know. I don't think he knew the apples or knew anything about Elephant Six or anything like that. I think that I interviewed Brian Wilson for the Westward magazine, which was Denver's weekly
Yeah.
magazine. I interviewed him when Smile came out because at that time the Apples lived in Denver, and I was the most famous Brian Wilson fan in the universe as far as Denver was concerned, and he was coming to town to perform Smile, and so they had me, the Brian Wilson fan, interview Brian for their magazine. You could
Mm.
look it up online. It's called, I can't remember. It has the word Apple in it.
Mm.
And you could look up Robert Schneider interviews Brian
Yeah.
Wilson, and you'll find the worst interview that's ever been conducted ever in the history of music, by other people's opinion, probably. Like it was so awkward. And he called me in my home, and I was talking to him, and it's like, I can't. And I had met him a few times before, but each time is like in a meet and greet scenario. It's like its own. He didn't know who I was, and in fact, as it turned out, they hadn't even filled him in with the hook, which was that he was talking with another musician that was a fan of his, or
Mm.
that was a producer. And in fact, they had me lined up because I was kind of similar to him in their eyes. I was able to ask questions about the studio and songwriting and things like that. And in fact, it was a pretty good interview from the perspective of getting information. But Brian didn't like it. He didn't like me, and he didn't like the interview. I was prying too much. I was asking about private stuff, like what kind of chocolate he liked in the studio. He was like, "What's going on here?" At one point, he asked that, I think, it was awkward for me because I was talking to my hero, and he was like, it's like he was somewhere between disinterested and bristling. And so, it reads very awkward. I encourage you to check it out because it actually is it's a very compelling piece of literature because it's I can't imagine you would see somebody be more painful than I am in print.
But it's hard to
So,
me. I mean, I know you'd met him a couple times before, but like interviewing your heroes is
it was amazing.
it's an amazing experience, but it's also difficult because
Oh
you
my God,
you're
I can't
trying
imagine.
to
Yeah. Doing with anybody else having to do it. It was and I'm not an interviewer. I don't normally do that. It is
yeah.
terrible.
Yeah.
It
Did
shouldn't
you
have
have
happened.
the Chris Farley like? Remember when you were in the Beach
Yeah,
Boys? That was awesome.
that's what it
Like
was like
that's
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, it's exactly like that.
Uh, I
um,
just to circle back to your discussion of Smile. I think well, I'm so glad right now that the Brian Wilson Smile exists. I came too late for the bootlegs, but the Smile Sessions that
the
collection is
Capitol thing's incredible.
oh so good.
Oh, I mean,
Um,
it's amazing. It's
yeah,
amazing. If that could have been finished,
yes. Oh
but
my goodness.
and to take the two things and meld them, I think that might have been done recently. My friend John Ferguson, my bandmate, and I, we can sing just like the Beach Boys, and we
Mhm.
always had the ambition of taking the Smile Sessions and overlaying the rest of the vocals. But this is like a huge ambition. The Beach Boys didn't pull it off, so it's a big task. But I think that recently somebody maybe did it. Like maybe some band took the Smile Sessions and overlaid Beach Boys, finished them in some way. So that might be worthwhile for us to track down.
Oh my
I think
gosh.
I saw something like that online.
I'm so excited if that
Yeah,
exists.
if that's true, I want to
Yeah.
hear it. But don't get too excited yet.
Yeah.
But
So that
or let's do it.
yeah. So that reminds me. So I'm just gonna say this as an aside, but then I'm gonna actually ask a question or a reflection. So the wouldn't it be nice that book, the recording of Pet Sounds?
Yes.
It's like a musicologist, and he talks about one of the reasons why the Beach Boys harmonies are so unbelievable is that, I mean, one, they're all from the same place and from basically the same family. So the the microtones that
Yes.
come from the voice box are all in like this peculiar harmony that you can't get if it's
Yes,
not
so they
like that.
perfectly blend while also filling in gaps between each other. I
Yes. So
agree. I agree.
I was thinking about that when I was just going back and listening to OTC records. And I'm like, these are all like Rustin kids, right? Who have like these similarly, I mean, I know you're from South Africa,
No,
right? But
but
like,
you're right. Well, I was a Rustin kid, and you're right. We sing similarly to each other. We all do.
yeah.
We all in different ways sang similarly to each other. We
Yeah,
learned to sing together.
but it's just like there's nothing like that when when there's this perfect harmony of like so many people where
Yes,
they're just filling in
yeah, I
perfect.
agree.
Like, yeah.
I agree.
But I
I love it. I love it. And it's also a beautiful feeling. In those recordings, a lot of times you're hearing us sing harmonies, but it's also convenient and feels good in that situation to have your arms around each other.
hmm.
So it's
Oh,
like
that's
you're
so
hugging
sweet.
while you're
Yeah.
singing. And I don't
Yeah.
know if that's the. I'm guessing the Beach Boys did that. Maybe not, but like at least in our recordings, when you're hearing that, you're often also hearing a group hug, and it's a really nice feeling,
Oh, that's so cool.
being as well as being a reasonably efficient way to group everybody around the
Oh,
microphone.
microphone. Yeah. I also think, I mean, just for it's kind of like mythic, but it's also um what's the term I want to use here? Instructive in a way that it you all didn't have Smile. You had the idea of Smile and bootlegs.
That's
And
true. That's
right.
true.
And so in some
Yes.
sense, like, you had Pet Sounds. Pet Sounds was finalized. Smile was mythic, and you
Oh my gosh,
had
it was
these
fragments of
intimations.
knowledge. It was
Yeah.
like Heraclitus.
And you're just like bootlegs are coming through, and you're like, okay, well,
Yes.
maybe it was this one, maybe it was that one. But you're
Yes.
also,
It was
it
like that.
becomes this, in to talk about the truth of imagination, like you got to think out of the Smile and what Smile could have been,
Yes.
and
Yes. You're
ended up
right. You're
creating
right.
this whole soundscape that you guys that's made. Um, Not
I
that
think
you wouldn't
you're
have
right. It's
benefited
interesting.
tremendously if Smile had come out in '67, don't get me wrong, but there is something about like the mysterious quality of the album that exists but doesn't exist,
God, you know
that
what? You
exists
are
in
right.
possibility.
Yes. No. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Okay. 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 What you're saying is so right. It's so right, and it goes with the thing about seeking, kind of like it's the Elephant Six. It's almost like we were trying to pursue a religion.
Mm.
We needed it. We were trying to pursue some religion. We were trying to pursue religion as a group, and or mystery. We're pursuing mystery, and we hit on the one album that you could never hear, as being our major influence. So like it got to be an evolution, and it's almost like you're participating in it.
Mhm.
It becomes a ritual where you're trying to bring into the world the you know the force of Smile or something like that.
Yeah, you're
Like,
like
and I do believe
participating in
that.
it.
I believe
Yeah.
we, yeah, and you are participating, and there's. I will say that looking back at that era, I felt like we used to read books about music, like you were talking about biographies.
Mhm.
We used to read these all the time about musicians and about pop history and about psychedelic music and punk rock and about the 60s. And the Beach Boys were like music history to us as young people. I think to young people in general, when you come to it with a sense of mythology. And that mythology is a mixture of what has been sculpted for you by the PR that's
Mhm.
around the artists. But that PR itself does actually emanate from what the artists are capable of representing. And then it's also sculpted for you by their works themselves, and then by the culture around that, and then the way that the people responded to it, and then the way history responded to it and remembered it. So like this is kind of
Mhm.
like when you look back at an artist from the past, there's layers to it. And so the 1960s, when it felt to us like a magic time that had been lost, where everybody cared about spirituality and also about each other. And the 80s felt very selfish and self-centered and kind of plastic in the 80s. It felt like that to be a teenager at that time. And the 1960s gave a sense of like this lost past, this idea of communes and togetherness, and all piling into a bus together, and like it's just like it gave us it gave us a model of how we wanted to try to be. In the 1980s, however, if you wanted to live a lifestyle like that, you were a punk rocker. You were a
Mhm.
hardcore punk rocker, and you were sleeping on people's couches, and you were piling into a van together, and you were playing in people's kitchens. And that was the actual music scene that existed that we started in. So
Mhm.
Elephant Six, when we started in the hardcore scene, and I believe that was the type of scene that supported us, and that was the scene. It wasn't that we were hardcore bands, but if you listen to early Elephant Six, there's a lot of yelling and hardcore in there.
Mhm.
There's punk rock, and and there's noisiness. And so, and I can't underestimate how important punk rock is as an ethos, and '80s hardcore was to us. So, there's this idea that from the '60s, though, that you could have this kind of reality, and we wanted to have it. And so there was a model for what your group, what your movement could look like, and then also, but there wasn't a sacred text,
Mhm.
It was Smile. It was this hole. It was this hole in the literature that was, and so because of that, there was a sense of mythology. There was the mythology of music history, and there was a hole in the mythology, and that hole was the place that we accessed it. It was the place that we entered the music scene through the hole that Smile left open. And we avoided getting burned by the music industry, or we tried to, and by being underground bands. And we made that decision like right up front, and it worked out really well. And I think that in a sense, it's like we were, it's just interesting. It's like it was the sun. It was the sun for us, and it's like you can't look at the sun because it blinds you, and it's like it burned Brian, but it also gave us a place to pass through into our own universe.